Welcome to Influential Entrepreneurs, bringing you interviews with elite business leaders and experts, sharing tips and strategies for elevating your business to the next level. Here's your host, Mike Saunders.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Influential Entrepreneurs. This is Mike Saunders, the Authority Positioning Coach. And today we have with us Simone Ahuja, who is the author of Disrupt It Yourself. Simone, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here.
So I think when you hear DIY, you think do it yourself, and your DIY is disrupt it yourself. So what are we disrupting?
Yeah, exactly. That was a kind of a play on words there, because I think it's really incumbent upon companies now to think about, how do we actually create new solutions internally? Things are changing. We have our traditional big competitors, but now I've got all these small, nimble startups that are moving quickly, that have access to technology in ways they never did before, that are really upending a lot of the stalwart traditional players that were out there for many years. So I think the question really becomes, not how do we generate incremental innovations over the course of decades, where in times past there were things that would get developed that had a really long, slow burn where they'd be bringing in revenue for decades, and that's not typically true anymore. Now we've got to think about how do you disrupt it yourself? How do we drive internal innovation on the inside of even big companies? How do we act more like startups, faster, more nimble, more frugal, and more effective?
So we're not talking necessarily disrupting an industry, kind of like you think of, Uber disrupted the transportation industry, things like that. But we're talking about kind of disrupting processes and organizational type approaches, correct?
All of the above. So I think it's a great question you asked, Mike. It could be processes internally. It could be other approaches to things internally, but very much so, I think companies today have to look at how do we disrupt our own industry. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, when we think of a spectrum of innovation, a lot of people think about different horizons, right? Horizons 1, 2, and 3. So if one is the close kind of core innovations, then we have sort of a connected innovation. Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 are the big things that are really disruptive, really breakthrough, that seem like they're far off into the horizon, though I think that timeline is changing. The organizations really have to think about how do we even disrupt ourselves, and we can't be afraid to cannibalize our own business, because the truth is, as we know, if we don't do it, someone else will do it for us.
Yeah, and as you were mentioning that, I was thinking of just a couple of thoughts where when you're working toward disrupting something, isn't it true that you might find in some of your work or working with clients that once they start talking about it, that helps it almost come to life and be clarified? And depending on what you're talking about disrupting, now you might be thinking way down the road, like, wishful thinking disruption, but now all of a sudden you're talking about it, and not only does that help clarify, codify it in your mind or your organization, but I would suspect and submit to you that it would help you become that thought leader and become part of your, maybe even a competitive advantage with your competitors, because, man, you're talking about, future trends, and they were just talking about how can we get your business.
Right. So I think there are two things that happen here. So one is at an organizational level, how do we disrupt it yourself? How do we become DIYers inside in an industry? And then there's that individual level, like who are the entrepreneurs on the inside of the organization, and what do they look like? What are they thinking about? What kind of ideas are they bringing forward? Now, sometimes these things seem to operate almost independently, right? So sometimes you have innovation labs, you have people with innovation in their title. You certainly have folks who are likely siloed in an R&D lab somewhere. Those are people who are typically bringing in innovation, but increasingly corporations are realizing, this is a volatile, complex, ambiguous environment that we're living in. We need to draw on all cylinders, and we need to bring in these entrepreneurs who are all the way around the corporation. They might be on the front lines, they might be talking to people on the phone, but they're closely connected to their end users, and they may have ideas. So how do we support them? Because when we think about supporting entrepreneurs, we think about the passion and purpose that they have. It's really interesting, Mike, when I researched my first book called Jugaad Innovation years ago, which is all about frugal innovation or high-value, low-cost innovation. We elicited several principles of Jugaad innovation, including about simplicity and staying focused, and including marginal communities. And one of the principles was called follow your heart. And I used to talk about this in a kind of a quiet way, never overemphasized it because it seemed like it was a bit too soft. But now, 3 years into the research of Disrupt It Yourself, we have a principle in this book. I call it engage passion and purpose. Because fundamentally what we're seeing is more and more innovations, and not just incremental innovations, are brought about by the intrapreneurs who are really closely connected to the problems that they're seeing, and that gives them this fuel, this extra energy to try to solve them problems. Having said that, it's really incumbent upon organizations to find ways to better support them, or those intrapreneurs will leave.
Yeah, I think when I hear intrapreneurialism, I love it because it's the creativity and the entrepreneurial spirit that organizations allow their teams to flourish in. But don't you find that sometimes organizations might feel like, oh, yeah, we allow that, but then they don't?
That's exactly right. So this is a big problem for intrapreneurs and innovators of all stripes, I would say, inside big organizations, is there's not always a clear path. So, for example, if I jump off a traditional management track to dive into innovation, even if it's being espoused by leadership, and sometimes especially if it's being broadcast widely because it's really useful for PR purposes, there's not always a clear pathway. I think there's actually a big risk. And some of the things that intrapreneurs have to do, as you say, these more entrepreneurial folks inside of a big company that usually are kind of burdened with these labyrinths and staid processes, they have to color out of the lines a little bit. They have to pioneer. They have to establish their own pathways. And sometimes when you do that, you upset the system, and the system might bite back. And that could be anything from being reprimanded to, maybe putting in a position that you don't want to be in, or even getting fired. So it's absolutely true. And again, I think the good news is we're starting to see a more systematic approach to innovation in general. We're starting to see innovation is becoming more and more of a discipline, right? So years ago, marketing and finance were not necessarily disciplines in companies. Yeah. We're seeing this formalization happen in innovation, and I actually believe that's really important to help grow innovation, so people don't feel like, well, if I do this, am I going to be punished for it?
Yeah, and where do you find that an organization should approach that line of, yeah, we allow it, but then in reality their culture is saying we don't really allow it? Because I was recently interviewing someone, we talked about this very principle about leadership, and he said there was a study done where this organization, the top brass were interviewed, and the top 3 things that they were saying that their teams, their organization, appreciated were X, Y, and Z, and then their employees were interviewed and said, tell us about the organization, and those same top 3 for the management team were the bottom 3. So there's a breakdown, and there really is. There's that breakdown of communication. So what would you recommend? Like if an organization really start disrupting, where do you start? Well, in my opinion, this is where you don't disrupt the industry first. You don't focus there. You disrupt your own organization and start with your people, and maybe disrupt it by going, we're not the old traditional, corporate feel. Let's allow some of that intrapreneurialism. And I think that's something you start with within, you perfect it, you kind of get your training wheels off, and then you move forward so that then you can start looking out to, your local industry, your broader industry, things like that. Where would you say were some things that people could start with?
There's a quote from Jim Lurie. He's the CEO of Stanley Black & Decker, and he wrote the foreword for Disrupt It Yourself. He was a client of Blood Oranges for many years, and his quote is really about how we have to break the rules, and we have to do it from the inside. And what he said was, companies, in order to truly disrupt within an organization, some of the company's rules have to be, frankly, overruled. And I think that couldn't be more true. So when we think about how do we actually support this, there are a few different things. So let me start with just a quick talk about culture. Everyone talks about innovation culture, but I think it's really hard to build a new culture inside out in a company that's been around for many years unless you put some kind of metrics or reinforcing mechanisms around them. So that's one. The other thing is thinking about how do we actually measure people, right? So if we have innovators and we're talking about innovation at the leadership level, there are a few things that people have to understand. They have to understand the why of it. Why is it important to our company? How is it connected to our innovation strategy? The role modeling of it, they need to see it exist in other places, and this is where I think things like innovation labs can be really useful, having coaching, being connected to other intrapreneurs. This is probably something you came across, Mike, as you were teaching about intrapreneurship, because the people who came before you, they can share some lessons, but they also become kind of that support that you really need. And then how do we measure them? So if I have a 360 review, is anything about innovation really included in there? Or is it sort of like everyone's saying, we want you to drive innovation, but your metrics and your measurements for how you're going to get paid are all just really directly tied to a P&L, for example. So very traditional. So that's one. And then the other thing, so I've had some clients that we've worked with where at some point we come to a bit of a loggerhead because, the initiative is there, the desire is there. But when, sometimes the really hard work, well, first of all, moving from ideas to execution is very hard work, right? The ideation piece is really starting to become well established in most companies. But then the very hard work can be, are we ready to shift our metrics? And not just for the feet on the street who are delivering on this innovation, but are we ready to change metrics for leadership? Are we ready to ask people, look, are you supporting this kind of approach? Are you supporting new ideas? Are you supporting experimentation? How much time, energy, budget are you putting towards it? And if you don't do that, are we willing to take away a part of your bonus, for example? So I think, these are the things that challenge most organizations, because the truth is, we've seen a lot of successes, maybe not as much in the sort of disruptive or breakthrough space when we have these little cells of innovation where people are running experiments. Leaders provide air cover so that people don't get sort of tackled or killed by the corporate immune system. But if we really want to see some big breakthroughs, then I think it's incumbent upon the organization to think about how we're measuring everyone, including the leaders who are talking about this.
Ooh, that's a really big one.
It's a big one.
And I think it's probably bigger than most people think, but it's kind of like, do as I say, not as I do. Well, hold up. If I'm holding you accountable, here's some transparency, right? I mean, those leaders being part of that metric and evaluation and things like that, I think that shows like, come on, let's do this together.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of connects to other things, so there have to be some softer metrics and some harder metrics, right? So if we think about innovation, it doesn't mean that we aren't learning. So I think learning metrics, a lot of organizations are talking about becoming learning organizations now, right? And I think that's an important part of problem solving and innovation, but by itself, it may or may not be enough, especially if people talk about things like failure. Everybody has been talking about fail forward, fail fast, and we've pretty much tossed that word out just shifted it into learning because it makes it more of a win-win rather than a win-fail, and I'm not going to talk about the things that I fail at. So that becomes an important part of all of this too, is how do we measure the value of the ROI, which could be what I call return on intelligence, that we learn. So those are some of the softer metrics. And then the harder ones are really more P&L related. So at what point do we start to make our first dollar? At what point do we start to see customers recommending this to other customers? And then thinking about our P&L, we can't just pretend that P&Ls don't exist. So I think we have to get really clear about what we're measuring, how, which, there's in a way, these metrics are their own portfolio of things that are a little softer and things that are much more closely connected to the business.
Yeah, that huge point, and the thing that makes me think of, or that now makes me think of this, all of this disruption and innovation, important, huge, entrepreneurial attitudes, important and huge. My question is, why now? What is it about today's economy, environment, business culture that makes this so important right now?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things are happening. So as we look at an environment that is moving really fast, it's more global, it's more interconnected, it's more competitive, we're seeing a couple of things happen. So I think most of us are familiar with the stats about the S&P 500. How long do organizations stay on the S&P 500? It used to be for decades, just a few years ago, and now in the next 10 years, the tenure of a company on the S&P 500 is more likely to be something around 10 to 12 years. So the lifespan of these organizations is shrinking because organizations are, I think there's still a little, everybody is aware of what's happening, but there's still a whole lot of, I've got my head in the sand and I'm not going to look up, because we actually have a growth engine based on our traditional products and services and business models. But that's not going to last very long. So that's one thing. The second thing is, who's going to support and sustain these businesses? I mean, if 14% of college grads today want to work in the big dog companies, right, the largest companies that we think about, that wasn't true just a few years ago. But today, new grads want to work in startups or start their own business. Or be in purpose-driven businesses. Where's the talent going to come from? And the reason I bring that up is because if we don't learn how to retain the people on the inside who are going to help us to grow and sustain, and we can't attract new talent because people feel like they're going to be just stuck on the rails of a traditional system, then we're not going to really have any good luck getting anywhere. And actually, that makes me think of one other thing, Mike, which is, the thing about disrupt it yourself and entrepreneurship that's so important is, I talked about, yes, the traits of the entrepreneur, they're action-oriented, they keep it frugal, they start without a ton of resources. And then what does the organization do? Like, what are the metrics and what are the reinforcing mechanisms that support this? But then also, in terms of management, it's so interesting because it really flies in the face of traditional management practices altogether. In other words, if an old management practice was, well, how do we keep people on the rails? How do we tell them what to do and make sure they do it? Entrepreneurship and disrupting it yourself is about managers who can create space, give people air cover, allow them to explore and still do work that's really relevant and valuable to the company. And then this becomes, this becomes what's valuable to everyone. So your shareholders, your organization, your bottom line, your employees, and especially your end users, whether they're consumers or businesses. So that's really the why of all this now. That's the big thing that's happening, that's creating this tremendous urgency for organizations to disrupt it yourself.
Yeah, but I think we could probably talk for another 4.5 days without taking a breath. But let's wrap up with what would you say is one final thought that an organization should key in on, be focused and aware of to start the process? And then what is the best way that they can reach out to you and pick up a copy of your new book?
Sure. So a couple of things I think that organizations can do. The first is thinking about their innovation strategy. It is really important for organizations to have a clear innovation strategy that's connected to the larger business, and then communicate that clearly to the rest of the organization. And then, it becomes really important to put systems in place that help to support that. And that's exactly what I outlined in Disrupt It Yourself. It's meant to be a little bit of a playbook, and we put an executive scorecard at the end of each chapter, and that has questions that you can ask so that you can think about each of the principles, like we talk about keeping it fluid, which is essentially agility, or keeping it frugal, keeping costs down. So these questions will help guide you to think about how can we get there in our organization. To get a hold of me, people can follow me on Twitter at Simone Ahuja. A great place right now, Mike, for your listeners to get a copy of the book is disruptityourselfbook.com. And I say that because if you go on there and order your book and then enter in a receipt number, For just the cost of the book, you get access for 60 days to my new e-course, which is $179 value.
Excellent. Well, I will make sure to put that in the show notes. That is wonderful. Thanks for that offer. And really appreciate you coming on the show today. Really enjoyed talking about innovation, disruption, and intrapreneurialism. So, Simone, thank you so much.
Likewise. Thanks, Mike.
You've been listening to Influential Entrepreneurs with Mike Saunders. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show or listen to past episodes, visit www.influentialentrepreneursradio.com.